This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1782 came early to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. By late October, frost had already claimed the last of the harvest, and residents of the scattered townships between Philadelphia and the Western Territories prepared for months of isolation. Among the estates that dotted the rolling hills south of the Conestoga River, one property stood apart, not for its grandeur, though it was substantial, but for the silence that seemed to emanate from within its stone walls. The estate belonged to the Whitmore family, who had acquired the land in 1768 through a transaction that, even at the time, raised questions among the local land registry office. Cornelius Whitmore, patriarch of the family, claimed to have purchased the 300-acre tract from a consortium of investors in Philadelphia. However, records maintained by the Lancaster County Courthouse show discrepancies in the deed transfer. The previous owners, listed only as a private concern, left no forwarding information. More curious still, the land had changed hands 5 times in the preceding decade, each transfer occurring within months of the previous one. The property itself possessed certain unusual characteristics that were noted in surveyor reports from the period. The main house, constructed of local limestone, stood at the terminus of a quarter-mile drive lined with carefully planted oak trees. These trees, according to botanical assessments conducted years later, were of a variety not native to Pennsylvania and showed signs of having been transplanted as mature specimens, an expensive and unusual undertaking for the time. The house faced south, contrary to the typical eastward orientation preferred by Pennsylvania builders, and its windows were positioned in such a manner that direct sunlight entered only during the middle hours of the day. Behind the main house, the land sloped downward toward a small creek that marked the southern boundary of the property. It was in this sloping area that the most distinctive feature of the estate had been constructed, a series of stone structures built partially into the hillside. To passing observers, these appeared to be standard root cellars and storage facilities. However, the scale and craftsmanship evident in their construction suggested purposes beyond simple food preservation. By 1792, Cornelius had been dead for 6 years, having passed the age of 53 from what the attending physician, Dr. Matthias Horn, recorded as a wasting illness of unknown origin. Horn's private notes, discovered among his papers after his own death in 1801, contain observations that were excluded from the official medical record. He wrote that Cornelius exhibited symptoms inconsistent with any recognized disease pattern. The patient experienced periods of extreme lucidity alternating with episodes during which he spoke in languages Horn could not identify. His physical deterioration followed no predictable course, with some days showing marked improvement followed by sudden declines. Most disturbing to Horn was Cornelius's insistence during his final week that he could hear voices emanating from beneath the house, calling to him in the darkness. Cornelius's widow, Prudence Whitmore, remained on the estate following his death. She was joined by their 2 adult offspring, Josiah, aged 28, and Temperance, aged 24. Records indicate that Prudence had been born Prudence Caldwell in 1738 in Chester County, Pennsylvania, to a family of modest means. Her marriage to Cornelius in 1761 had elevated her social standing considerably, though it also appears to have isolated her from her birth family. No correspondence between Prudence and her relatives survives after 1770, and when her younger brother attempted to visit the estate in 1782, he was turned away at the gate with a message that Prudence was indisposed. The Whitmores maintained a peculiar relationship with their neighbors. Unlike other families of means who participated in county social gatherings, quarterly meetings, and seasonal celebrations, the residents of the Whitmore estate kept to themselves. Deliveries of supplies were left at the property's boundary gate, payment deposited in a locked box attached to the stone pillar. On the rare occasions when a family member ventured into the village of Strasbourg, some 3 miles distant, they conducted their business with minimal conversation and departed swiftly. Among the county's tradesmen community, stories circulated. Reuben Stoltzfus, a carpenter who had been contracted to repair storm damage to the estate's main house in 1788, later told acquaintances that he had been confined to working only in designated areas. "They marked the floorboards where I could walk," he reportedly said. "Had me leave my tools outside each evening and collect them fresh in the morning. The eldest one, Josiah, he watched every nail I drove, never spoke unless necessary, and his eyes, they had a quality I cannot properly describe, as though he were calculating something with each breath he took." Stoltzfus also mentioned that during his 3 weeks of work at the estate, he never saw the same room twice. Each morning he would be directed to a different section of the house, always with specific instructions about where he could step and what he could touch. He noted that certain doors remained locked throughout his tenure, and that on one occasion, when he accidentally brushed against one of these doors, Josiah appeared within seconds, though Stoltzfus had believed himself alone in that wing of the house. Records from the Lutheran Church in Strasbourg show that the Whitmores attended services only twice annually on specific dates that corresponded to no recognized religious observance. Pastor Wilhelm Hoffmann noted in his personal journal that when he attempted to visit the estate to discuss spiritual matters, he was turned away at the gate by a hired hand who stated that the family requires no pastoral counsel at this time. Hoffmann wrote that he confessed to a sense of unease as he departed. The property itself seemed to resist intrusion. The trees along the drive had been planted in such a manner that they formed a barrier of sorts, and the house stood at such a distance from the road that one could not observe its windows clearly. What he could see suggested the curtains were drawn, even in daylight. Hoffmann made 2 subsequent attempts to reach the family over the following year. On both occasions, he was similarly rebuffed. He noted in his journal that, while he bore no ill will toward the Whitmores, he had begun to feel a moral obligation to investigate their circumstances more thoroughly. However, before he could act on this intention, he received a letter from Josiah Whitmore, written in a precise and educated hand, thanking him for his concern, but firmly stating that the family's spiritual needs were adequately addressed through private devotion and required no external guidance. The Whitmore family's financial activities were equally opaque. Cornelius had established an account with the Bank of Pennsylvania in 1770, and deposits continued to be made regularly even after his death. The source of these funds was never clear. The estate produced no crops for market, maintained no livestock beyond what was necessary for household consumption, and engaged in no visible trade. Yet the family paid their accounts promptly and in full, suggesting a steady income from somewhere. A bank clerk named Thaddeus Morton, who handled the Whitmore account from 1785 to 1792, later testified that deposits were always delivered by courier, never by a family member directly. These couriers changed frequently, and none could or would provide information about the source of the funds. The amounts deposited varied, but followed a pattern that Morton found noteworthy. They occurred at intervals of exactly 43 days, without exception, regardless of season or circumstance. In March of 1792, a traveling magistrate named Horace Pendergast passed through Lancaster County to review property disputes and outstanding legal matters. During his stay in Strasbourg, he made inquiries about the Whitmore estate, as there had been a question regarding property boundaries with an adjacent farm. According to Pendergast's official correspondence preserved in the Pennsylvania State Archives, he sent a notice to the estate requesting a meeting to clarify the boundary markers. The notice went unanswered. Pendergast made a second attempt to contact the family. This time he traveled to the estate personally. What he reported upon returning to Strasbourg that evening raised concerns among local authorities. In a letter to the Lancaster County Sheriff, Pendergast wrote that he arrived at the Whitmore property at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The gate was closed but not locked. He proceeded up the drive on foot, as is proper when visiting, without prior arrangement. The house appeared well maintained from the exterior, though he observed that all shutters were closed. He knocked at the main entrance repeatedly. After several minutes, he heard movement within, but no one came to the door. He called out, identifying himself and his purpose. The movement ceased. He waited for a quarter hour, then walked the perimeter of the house, thinking perhaps the family had not heard him. At the rear of the property, he noticed a stone structure built into the hillside, constructed in the style of a root cellar but considerably larger. The door to this structure was secured with a lock of unusual design. He stated that he was not easily unsettled, but found himself unwilling to linger. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing. He returned to the gate and departed. Pendergast's letter continued with additional observations that he had not initially planned to include, but which troubled him sufficiently to document. He noted that as he had walked the perimeter of the house, he had the persistent sensation of being observed, though he could detect no movement behind the windows. More peculiarly, he mentioned that the ground itself felt different beneath his feet near the stone structure, more solid, almost hollow sounding when his boot struck it, as though the earth had been compacted or there were empty spaces beneath. The sheriff at that time, Barnabas Kreider, was a practical man not given to superstition. However, he was troubled by Pendergast's account and decided to investigate. On March 23rd, accompanied by 2 deputies, Kreider rode to the Whitmore estate. According to the incident report filed 3 days later, the sheriff and his men found the property in apparent order. Josiah Whitmore answered the door after a prolonged delay and explained that the family had been occupied with private matters and had not heard the magistrate's earlier visit. When questioned about the unopened correspondence, Josiah stated that they had been away from the estate for a period and had not yet reviewed their post. Kreider was not satisfied with this explanation. In his report, he noted that Josiah Whitmore's demeanor was cordial but contained. He answered questions directly but volunteered no additional information. When Kreider inquired about his mother and sister, Josiah stated they were well but indisposed to receive visitors. Kreider observed through the partially open door that the interior of the house was dimly lit, despite the hour being mid-afternoon. There was a smell, faint but noticeable, that reminded him of damp earth and something herbal, though he could not identify the specific plant. Josiah made it clear that their presence was an intrusion, though he phrased his objections with propriety. They departed, having achieved nothing of substance. Kreider's deputy, a man named Jakob Weiss, included his own observations in a supplementary report. Weiss noted that while they stood at the door speaking with Josiah, he glimpsed someone moving past a window on the second floor, a pale figure that appeared and disappeared so quickly he could not determine if it was prudence or temperance. What struck him as odd was the manner of movement, which he described as unnaturally smooth, as though the person were gliding rather than walking. Weiss admitted in his report that this impression might have been due to the angle of observation or a trick of the light, but he felt compelled to document it nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, reports began to reach the sheriff's office from those who lived near the Whitmore property. Samuel Byler, whose farm shared a boundary with the estate, reported hearing sounds at night, not voices or screams, but rhythmic impacts, as though heavy objects were being moved or earth was being turned. These sounds occurred with regularity, always between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning. Byler stated that he had initially attributed the noises to natural causes, perhaps animals or falling branches, but the pattern was too consistent. He also noted that his livestock had become agitated whenever they grazed in the pasture closest to the Whitmore boundary, refusing to approach the fence line. Baylor's wife, Catherine, provided additional details when interviewed by one of Kreider's deputies. She reported that on 2 occasions she had observed lights moving across the Whitmore property after dark. These were not the steady glow of lanterns carried in a normal fashion, but rather brief flashes that appeared and disappeared at irregular intervals, sometimes at ground level and sometimes appearing to emanate from beneath the earth. When her husband investigated the fence line in daylight, he found no evidence of disturbance, but he did notice that the grass on the Whitmore side of the boundary appeared to be dying in circular patterns, each circle approximately 10 feet in diameter. Another neighbor, Lydia Zimmerman, reported to Pastor Hoffman that she had observed unusual activity around the Whitmore estate during the full moon. Zimmerman, a widow who lived alone following the death of her husband in 1789, was known for her level-headedness and reluctance to engage in gossip. That she came forward at all suggested genuine concern. She stated that on 3 consecutive months she had seen figures moving along the ridge behind the main house, always just after moonrise. The figures appeared to be following a specific path, walking in single file from the house toward the stone structures. She counted between 4 and 6 individuals, though the distance and darkness made it difficult to be certain. What disturbed her most was that the figures moved in complete silence. No voices, no sound of footsteps, nothing. Zimmerman also mentioned an encounter she had with Temperance Whitmore in Strasbourg in early September of 1792. Zimmerman had been purchasing supplies at the general store when Temperance entered. The 2 women were acquainted, though not intimately, from years past. Zimmerman attempted to greet her, but Temperance gave no indication of recognition. Her expression was described as distant, almost vacant. She conducted her business quickly and left without speaking to anyone beyond what was absolutely necessary. The store's proprietor, Ernst Mueller, remarked afterward that Temperance had seemed unwell, with an unusual paleness to her skin and dark circles beneath her eyes. The matter reached a critical point in late October when a traveling peddler, Abraham Yost, failed to return from his route through the southern portion of the county. Yost's family reported that his planned stops included the Whitmore estate, where he had intended to offer hardware goods and household items. The man was experienced, knew the roads well, and carried letters from previous customers recommending his merchandise. His wife, Rebecca, stated that Abraham had expressed some reluctance about visiting the Whitmore property, having heard rumors, but had decided to proceed as it was on his established route, and he had no concrete reason to avoid it. His disappearance prompted Sheriff Kreider to organize a search. The search party, consisting of the sheriff, 3 deputies, and several volunteers from Strasbourg, traced Yost's route. They found his wagon abandoned on the road approximately 1 mile from the Whitmore estate. The horse was still hitched, but agitated, with foam around its mouth suggesting distress. The wagon's contents appeared undisturbed, with goods neatly arranged as they would be for display. Yost's personal effects, a leather satchel containing his account book and currency, remained in the wagon seat. There were no signs of struggle or theft. Yost himself was nowhere to be found. The horse, once calmed, was examined by a local veterinarian named Heinrich Vogel. Vogel noted that the animal exhibited symptoms consistent with extreme fear, but showed no physical injuries. What puzzled Vogel was the presence of a peculiar substance on the horse's hooves, a fine, grayish powder that he could not identify. When analyzed by a chemist in Lancaster, the powder was determined to contain elements of limestone mixed with organic compounds that the chemist described as possibly botanical in origin. Though he could not be more specific, the search party proceeded to the Whitmore estate. This time, when they arrived at the main house, no one answered their calls. The front door was locked. Moving around the property, they noticed that the shutters on the ground floor windows had been reinforced with additional boards from the interior. The stone structure at the rear of the property, the one Pendergast had noted, remained secured with its unusual lock. The lock itself was of a design that none of the search party recognized. Intricate, with multiple tumblers, and crafted from a dark metal that did not appear to be standard iron or steel. Kreider made the decision to force entry. Using a crowbar from the abandoned wagon, his deputies broke the lock on the rear stone structure. What they found inside was documented in a report that remained sealed in the Lancaster County Archives until 1853, when it was transferred to the Pennsylvania Historical Society as part of a broader collection of early legal documents. The report, written in Kreider's precise hand, describes the interior of the structure in considerable detail. The space extended approximately 30 feet into the hillside, supported by stone arches of evident craftsmanship that suggested the work of skilled masons, possibly European-trained, given the style of construction. The ceiling was vaulted, reaching a height of approximately 9 feet at its apex. The walls had been plastered and painted white at some point, though moisture had caused sections of the plaster to peel away, revealing the stone beneath. The floor had been excavated to a depth of approximately 8 feet below the entrance level, accessed by stone steps that descended in a gentle curve. Along the walls were recesses, similar in form to those found in burial crypts, each approximately 7 feet long and 2 feet wide. There were 12 of these recesses in total, 6 along each side wall. Upon inspection, these recesses were empty. Recesses, though they showed signs of recent use, the stone surfaces had been swept clean and bore no dust or debris. In several of the recesses, Kreider found small iron hooks embedded in the stone at regular intervals, suggesting that something had been hung or secured there at some point. In the center of the chamber stood a table of heavy oak construction, approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. The surface of the table bore scratches and stains that suggested long use. Upon this table were arranged various implements whose purpose Kreider could not immediately determine. Metal rods of varying lengths, some straight and some curved, all showing signs of careful maintenance. Ceramic vessels containing dried plant material that produced a bitter, medicinal smell when disturbed, and several bound journals filled with notations in what appeared to be cipher, or a foreign alphabet, that bore resemblance to Latin, but was not quite readable as such. Most disturbing was a series of detailed drawings found in one of the journals. These drawings depicted the property's layout from an aerial perspective, showing not only the buildings and grounds visible above the surface, but also extensive networks of underground chambers and passages. According to these drawings, the stone structure they had entered was merely the entrance to a much more elaborate system that extended beneath the entire estate. The drawings showed at least 7 additional chambers of varying sizes, all connected by narrow passages, with the deepest chamber positioned directly beneath the main house at an estimated depth of 40 feet below ground level. The report continues with Kreider's account of their subsequent actions. After documenting the contents of the stone chamber, they proceeded to force entry into the main house through a rear window, the glass of which they broke with some reluctance, given that they were technically trespassing on private property. However, the circumstances, the abandoned wagon, the missing peddler, the locked and barricaded house, provided sufficient justification for the intrusion. The interior of the house confirmed their suspicions of recent abandonment. Furniture remained in place, including several valuable pieces that would not have been left behind in a planned departure. Personal effects, however, had been largely removed. Clothing, documents, small portable items of value, these were gone. In the parlor they found a small writing desk with its drawers open and empty, as though someone had hastily sorted through papers and taken what they needed while leaving the rest. On the desk's surface lay a single document, a deed transferring ownership of the estate to an entity identified only as the Lancaster Preservation Trust. The deed was dated October 20th, 6 days prior to their search. It bore the signature of Josiah Whitmore, witnessed by two individuals whose names, Ezekiel Mordaunt and Silas Crow, meant nothing to any member of the search party. Further exploration of the house revealed additional details that troubled the searchers. In what appeared to be a study or library on the ground floor, the walls were lined with empty bookshelves. The shelves themselves were dusty, suggesting that books had recently been removed. On one shelf, partially hidden behind where a row of books would have stood, they found a small leather-bound notebook. This notebook, unlike the journals found in the stone chamber, was written in clear English, in a feminine hand that was later identified as belonging to Temperance Whitmore. The notebook contained entries dating from January 1791 to October 1792. The early entries were mundane observations about weather, household tasks, and occasional social encounters. However, beginning in May of 1791, the tone shifted. Temperance wrote about growing concerns regarding her brother's activities and her mother's declining health. She mentioned that Josiah had become increasingly secretive, spending long hours in parts of the house and property that had been previously unused. She wrote about finding her mother sitting motionless in her room for hours at a time, staring at nothing, responding to questions with delay or not at all. One entry from August 1791 was particularly revealing. Temperance wrote that she had followed Josiah one night, watching from a distance as he descended into the stone structure with several large bundles. She had waited for him to emerge, but after 2 hours had passed with no sign of him, she had returned to the house, troubled by what purpose could require such extended time underground. She noted that when Josiah finally appeared at breakfast the following morning, his clothes were covered in dust, and his hands bore fresh scrapes and abrasions, yet he offered no explanation and deflected her questions. The notebook entries became increasingly distressed as they progressed through 1792. Temperance wrote about sounds at night, movements in the walls, footsteps in empty corridors, voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. She mentioned that she had attempted to leave the estate on 3 separate occasions, packing a small bag and preparing to walk to Strasbourg, but each time she found herself unable to complete the departure. She described this inability not as external restraint, but as a kind of internal compulsion, a certainty that leaving was somehow impossible, though she could not articulate why. The final entry in the notebook was dated October 18th, 2 days before the deed transfer. It read simply, "He says the transition is complete, and we must fulfill the terms. Mother has already gone ahead. I am to follow tonight. I do not understand what awaits, but I find I no longer possess the will to resist. If this record is found, know that we did not leave by choice, but by obligation to agreements made before I was old enough to comprehend their nature." Abraham Yost's body was discovered 2 days later by a hunter, located in a ravine approximately 3 miles from the Whitmore estate. The county coroner, Dr. Ignatius Ferber, conducted an examination. According to his report, Yost had died from exposure and exhaustion. His boots were worn through, suggesting he had walked a considerable distance through rough terrain. More puzzling were markings on his forearms, regular patterns of what appeared to be self-inflicted scratches, as though he had been attempting to mark time or count something. In his coat pocket was found a scrap of paper bearing a series of numbers, 3, 17, 5, 11, 23. These numbers corresponded to no known system of measurement or navigation. Dr. Ferber noted in a supplementary report that Yost's body showed additional anomalies. His fingernails contained traces of the same grayish powder found on the horse's hooves. His expression, even in death, appeared troubled, with features contracted in what might have been fear or confusion. Most unusual was a small burn mark on his right palm, circular and precise, as though he had pressed his hand against something hot with deliberate pressure. The burn was fresh, inflicted within hours of death. The journals recovered from the stone chamber were examined by several learned individuals in Philadelphia, including a professor of ancient languages at the College of Philadelphia named Dr. Augustus Pemberton. Pemberton's assessment, preserved in his personal correspondence with a colleague, stated that the text appeared to be a constructed language or code based on existing linguistic patterns. Certain recurring symbols resembled alchemical notation common in European manuscripts of the 16th and 17th centuries, while others suggested mathematical formulas related to geometry and proportion. He noted that what was most remarkable was the precision of the writing. These were not the ravings of a disturbed mind, but rather the methodical documentation of a deliberate process. The intent behind this documentation remained opaque, but he was convinced that whoever authored these journals believed they were recording something of genuine significance. Pemberton made an attempt to translate several passages using various cipher methods available to scholars of the period. He achieved partial success with one section, which appeared to describe a process involving specific measurements, timing based on lunar phases, and the preparation of what might be either chemical compounds or medicinal preparations. However, the text included terms that had no equivalent in English, German, Latin, or French, and Pemberton eventually concluded that complete translation would require either a key that he did not possess or knowledge of context that had been deliberately obscured. Further investigation of the estate revealed additional details. In the cellar beneath the main house, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen that had been concealed beneath a heavy rug, workers found evidence of extensive excavation. The earthen floor had been dug up and refilled in a grid pattern, each section approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, dimensions that immediately suggested graves. However, when these areas were carefully excavated under Sheriff Kreider's supervision, they contained nothing but disturbed soil and small quantities of ash mixed with fragments of what appeared to be pottery or ceramics. One of the most unsettling discoveries came from what had been Temperance Whitmore's bedchamber. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a collection of letters, apparently written by Temperance herself but never sent. The letters were addressed to various individuals, including family members who had died years prior, and persons whose existence could not be verified through church records or census data. The content of these letters suggested that Temperance had been aware of activities taking place on the estate that disturbed her greatly, but felt powerless to intervene or leave. In one letter, addressed to her deceased father Cornelius, she wrote, "I no longer recognize the place we call home. Josiah has continued your work with a fervor that frightens me. Mother has withdrawn entirely, spending her days in silent contemplation of something I cannot see or understand. I attempted to leave last spring, but found I could not. The boundaries we have drawn, the obligations we have assumed, they hold us here as surely as iron chains. I wonder if you understood in those final days what price was being paid for the prosperity you secured, and whether you considered it justified." Another letter, undated and addressed to no one specifically, contained more explicit concerns. Temperance wrote about witnessing preparations for what she called transitions, describing how Josiah would descend into the underground chambers with materials and emerge hours later looking exhausted but satisfied. She wrote about finding her mother in trances, unresponsive to her presence, and about hearing multiple voices in the house when she knew only the 3 of them were present. She mentioned that the estate felt different at night, as though it were occupied by more than just their family, though she never saw anyone else. The fate of Prudence, Josiah, and Temperance Whitmore was never definitively established. No records of their departure existed in any neighboring county. No bodies were found on the property, despite an exhaustive search that included probing the ground in numerous locations and draining the small creek that ran along the property boundary. The mysterious deed transferring the estate proved to be legally void, as the Lancaster Preservation Trust did not exist as a registered entity with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The witnesses named on the deed could not be located, and their names appeared in no public records. The property was declared abandoned and eventually sold at auction in 1795. The purchaser, a merchant from Philadelphia named Edmund Kressler, intended to convert the estate into a productive farm. Kressler hired a crew of workers and moved to the property in April of that year. His intention was to clear the underground structures, fill them in, and create more arable land. However, Kressler abandoned the project within 6 months, citing insurmountable difficulties without elaborating on their nature. Years later, in a letter to his business partner, Kressler provided more detail. He wrote that the workers had refused to continue after several incidents. Tools disappeared and reappeared in locations where they had not been left. Several workers reported feeling unwell while working near the stone structures, experiencing headaches and disorientation that resolved once they left the property. Most troubling were accounts of sounds coming from beneath the ground, not the settling of soil or movement of water, but sounds that resembled, according to the workers, human activity. Kressler himself experienced something that convinced him to leave. He wrote that one evening, while reviewing documents in what had been the main house, he heard footsteps in the rooms above him. He called out, thinking one of his workers had remained on the property but received no response. The footsteps continued, moving from room to room in a deliberate pattern. When Kressler ascended the stairs to investigate, he found the upper floor empty and undisturbed. However, on the floor of what had been Josiah's chamber, he found a series of numbers scratched into the wooden boards, 3 to 17, 5, 11, 23. He recognized these as the same numbers found on the paper in Abraham Yost's pocket, though he could not explain how they had appeared in the room. The estate changed hands repeatedly over the following decades, never remaining with a single owner for more than a few years. Each transfer occurred under circumstances that suggested the property was somehow unwelcoming to sustained habitation. Families would move in with optimism and leave within months, citing personal reasons or business opportunities elsewhere, but neighbors noted that those who occupied the estate seemed to age more rapidly during their tenure, developing a drawn, exhausted appearance that lifted once they departed. In 1834, during renovations to convert the property into a school, workers discovered a sealed chamber behind a false wall in what had been Cornelius Whitmore's study. Access to this chamber required removing several courses of brick that had been expertly laid to blend with the surrounding wall structure. The chamber was approximately 10 feet square, with no windows and only the single access point that had been sealed. Inside this chamber were additional journals, these ones written in conventional English, along with various items including surveying instruments, architectural drawings, and a collection of what appeared to be contracts written in both English and other languages. The entries in these journals, spanning from 1768 to 1782, revealed that Cornelius had been engaged in a prolonged negotiation with an unnamed party regarding the acquisition of knowledge and methodology. The specifics of this knowledge were never explicitly stated, but references throughout the journals suggested it related to some form of preservation or continuation that operated according to principles Cornelius described as ancient and previously restricted to a select few. One entry from 1775 read, "The terms are harsh, but the alternative is oblivion for all I have built. I have secured assurances that the methodology is sound, tested across generations in other locations throughout Europe and the colonies. The infrastructure must be constructed precisely following the schematics provided. Once initiated, The process becomes self-sustaining, requiring only periodic maintenance and the fulfillment of certain obligations. My offspring will inherit not just property but purpose. They will understand, in time, that some prices are worth paying for continuity. A later entry, dated 1780, showed deterioration in Cornelius's mental state, or perhaps a growing awareness of consequences he had not fully anticipated. He wrote, "I begin to question whether full disclosure was provided regarding the cumulative effects. The alterations to perception, the gradual distancing from conventional thought patterns, these were mentioned only in passing by my contact, presented as minor inconveniences. Prudence no longer recognizes the man she married. I see it in her eyes. She speaks to me, but seems to be addressing someone who merely resembles her husband. Josiah demonstrates aptitude, but lacks the necessary restraint. I fear what he may attempt after my departure from this life. The infrastructure we have built beneath this place, the arrangements we have made, they were intended to secure continuity. But continuity of what? I am no longer certain I can articulate the answer with any precision. The contracts found in the sealed chamber were written on parchment of unusual quality, seemingly resistant to the deterioration that would be expected after decades of storage. Several of these contracts were in English and appeared to be standard property agreements or service arrangements, though the terms were vague and the parties involved were identified only by initials or symbols. Other contracts were in languages that no one consulted could identify with certainty, though one scholar suggested they might be variants of medieval German or Dutch, mixed with technical terminology from trades like mining or metallurgy. One document in particular drew attention. It was a diagram, meticulously drawn, showing what appeared to be a network of underground passages and chambers extending beneath the property in a pattern that was almost geometrically perfect. The chambers were labeled with numbers and symbols, and lines connecting them were marked with what might have been measurements or timing notations. At the center of the diagram was a chamber marked with a symbol that resembled an inverted triangle within a circle. Handwritten notes around the margins of the diagram included phrases like optimal configuration, maintained intervals, and synchronized transitions. The school project was abandoned after several incidents involving workers reporting unusual experiences. Multiple workers described sensations of being watched, particularly when working alone in certain areas of the property. Sounds with no identifiable source were reported, distant voices, footsteps, and on one occasion, what a worker described as singing in a language he did not recognize, coming from beneath the ground where he was standing. There were also episodes of temporal disorientation, wherein workers would begin a task believing it to be morning and discover, with surprise that felt almost like shock, that hours had passed and it was now afternoon, with no clear memory of the intervening time. The building stood vacant until 1847, when it was demolished. Even the demolition proved problematic. The foreman, Gustav Bergman, noted in his work diary that the underground chambers extended far beyond what architectural surveys had indicated. Some passages appeared to descend to depths that seemed structurally improbable given the known geology of the area. The stone used in the construction of these chambers was of a type not quarried locally, suggesting it had been transported from considerable distance at great expense. The quality of the masonry suggested the work of craftsmen with specialized knowledge. Rather than fully excavate these spaces, which would have required extensive labor and expense with no clear benefit, Bergman ordered them filled with rubble and sealed with concrete. However, his workers reported difficulty completing this task. Twice, sections that had been filled and sealed were found empty the following day, with the rubble apparently having shifted or settled in a manner that created new voids. Eventually, Bergman brought in additional concrete and created a solid cap over the entire area, effectively entombing whatever remained below. Today, a modest farmhouse occupies a portion of what was once the Whitmore estate. The current owners, who purchased the property in 1968, report no unusual occurrences. However, certain curiosities remain. Aerial surveys conducted during the 1960s as part of an agricultural planning initiative revealed geometric patterns in the field soil that do not correspond to any modern or historical land use. These patterns consist of circles and lines arranged in what appears to be a deliberate configuration, visible from above but not perceptible from ground level. Local historians have noted that the property attracts an unusually high number of inquiries from individuals researching early Pennsylvania settlement patterns, though the Whitmore family itself left few conventional records. Several academic researchers have expressed interest in conducting archaeological surveys of the site, but none have proceeded beyond preliminary discussions with the current owners. The journals recovered from various locations on the estate were eventually donated to the Lancaster County Historical Society, where they remain available for research. However, few scholars have examined them in detail. Those who have attempted comprehensive analysis report difficulty in maintaining sustained focus on the material. The text, while clearly written and apparently meaningful, resists coherent interpretation. One researcher described spending 3 hours reading a single journal and, upon completion, finding that she could not summarize its contents with any accuracy. Dr. Helena Groff, a professor of early American history who examined the Whitmore documents in 1955 as part of a broader study of Pennsylvania settlement patterns, published a brief article in the Pennsylvania Historical Quarterly. She concluded that the Whitmore case represents a peculiar intersection of recorded fact and narrative gap. We have extensive documentation of their presence, their property, their transactions. Yet the substance of their lives, their motivations, and their ultimate fate remain fundamentally obscure. What they were attempting, if indeed they were attempting anything beyond ordinary existence, cannot be determined from available evidence. We are left with fragments, disturbing fragments certainly, but fragments nonetheless. Groff's article included speculation that the Whitmores might have been involved in some form of experimental agriculture or mineral extraction that they wished to keep secret for commercial reasons. However, she acknowledged that this explanation failed to account for many of the documented details, particularly the elaborate underground constructions and the nature of Cornelius's journals. The stone chamber that Sheriff Kreider first entered in 1792 still exists, buried beneath layers of fill dirt and forgotten. The farmers who work the land above it know nothing of what lies beneath their fields. The county records that might provide clearer answers were largely destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1841. The few surviving documents raise more questions than they resolve. What remains certain is this. The Whitmore family came to Lancaster County in 1768. They built their estate with purpose and precision. They maintained their privacy with deliberate isolation, and in the autumn of 1792, they ceased to exist in any verifiable sense, leaving behind only structures beneath the earth and writings that no one has successfully decoded. The land remembers in its way. The patterns persist in the soil, and occasionally farmers report that in certain sections of the field, nothing will grow, no matter how carefully they tend it. The earth there, they say, feels different beneath the plow, denser, colder, as though it had been compressed by weight that should not exist. Some have observed that these barren patches form a pattern when viewed from elevated positions, though the significance of that pattern, if any, remains unclear. In recent years, metal detector enthusiasts have requested permission to search the property, citing historical interest. Most such requests are politely declined by the current owners, who prefer not to have strangers disturbing their land. However, one such enthusiast, who gained permission in 1994, reported finding several items of interest. These included coins dated to the late 18th century, fragments of what appeared to be hand-forged tools of unknown purpose, and curiously, several pieces of that same dark metal from which the lock on the stone chamber had been crafted. Analysis of this metal revealed an unusual composition with trace elements that suggested either specialized manufacturing techniques or deliberate alloying for specific properties. The numbers found in Abraham Yost's pocket and later scratched into the floorboard, 3-17, 5-11, 23, have been the subject of occasional speculation. Various interpretations have been proposed: coordinates, dates, measurements, or some form of personal code. None have been substantiated. What is known is that these same numbers appear, in various arrangements, in the margins of several pages in Cornelius's journals, always without explanation or context. For those who study Pennsylvania history, the Whitmore case remains an anomaly, a collection of documented facts that refuse to resolve into a coherent narrative. The family existed, their property was real, their disappearance was noted and investigated. Yet the essential question, what actually happened, remains open. Perhaps that is as it should be. Not every historical mystery requires solution. Some events resist interpretation not because evidence is lacking, but because the framework for understanding them does not exist within conventional historical analysis. The Whitmores left traces, but what those traces indicate depends on assumptions about what is possible and what is not. The estate is quiet now. Crops grow in most of the fields. The farmhouse stands solid and unremarkable. Visitors to the area, unaware of the history, see only peaceful rural landscape. But those who know the story sometimes pause at the property's edge, looking toward where the old house once stood, and wonder what really happened in that autumn of 1782 and whether some questions are better left unasked.